Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this book discussion, Print Cultures in the 19th Century Islamic World. This event is hosted by the Center for Arts and Humanities and the Department of Fine Arts and Art History, with additional support from the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, CAMES at AUB. This is a public discussion of Hala Aouji's recent monograph. The expensive book is circulating somewhere. Hopefully.
It's actually here. It's not
okay.
okay.
Very
it could
good.
circulate.
We didn't lose it yet.
Just don't get it dirty. I don't have many copies left.
$140 for those who are eager to know. She gets 40% discount for being the author. Knowledge is priceless, of course. So this is a public discussion of Hala Aouji's recent monograph on 19th century Arabic book culture. Printing Arab Modernity, Book Culture, and the American Press in 19th Century Beirut, published by Brill in 2016. This book is located at the intersection of art history, book and print culture, and studies of Arab modernity and Ottoman historiographies. I, of course, would like to congratulate my colleague Hala for this major accomplishment. Of course, we're all very proud of Hala. But what's nice about these events is that our authors are usually celebrated, their stars everywhere, and no one knows at AUB about what they have done and why they are stars. So an event like this actually helps us know why these people are stars. Printing Arab Modernity examines the American Protestant mission's Arabic publications printed in Beirut for Ottoman readers during the period dominated by Islamic and Christian manuscript practices. This book also explores the growing significance of the visual dimensions of print for such audiences. Specifically, how print reflected a push-pull dynamic between the continuity of scribal customs and an experimentation with new technologies. This was indicative of a moment when local intellectuals were formulating a visual language that negotiated their varied communal concerns, political motivations, and intellectual conceptions of a modern society. Although the subject of this book centers on the Arab Nahda period in Ottoman Beirut, the book discussion considers a wider, globally comparative perspective by exploring print-related developments during this period in the Global South, specifically Southeast Asia. I hope that today the conversation between Dr. Jan van der Putten and Dr. Aouji will provide a new perspective from which we can consider the history of book culture during transitional periods such as the 19th century, and to explore how notions of modernity varied or overlapped in different regions, which also saw encounters between Islamic communities and Christian missionary groups. But before we start this conversation, let me introduce our protagonists for today. Dr. Jan van der Putten is Professor Astronomistik in the Department of Southeast Asia at the University of Hamburg, where he teaches on Southeast Asian literatures and cultures. Traditional Malay writing is one of his main research areas, and he is a member of the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures at the University of Hamburg, supervising a research project about the changing practices of the 19th century Malay manuscript economy. His work also ventures into other types and periods of Malay language cultural traditions, where he explores the meaning of traditional and popular Malay texts and how these texts are disseminated among peoples and exchanged between cultures. He has published widely on contemporary and historical issues related to the politics of language, book production, and erotica in Southeast Asia. Dr. Hala Aouji is Assistant Professor of Art History at AUB's Department of Fine Arts and Art History, where she teaches courses on the art, architecture, and material culture of the Islamic world. She is currently a faculty fellow in 2016-2017 at AUB's Mellon Foundation-funded Center for Arts and Humanities, during which she is developing curricula and research related to her current project, Fann al-Jara'id, the art of the Arabic periodical in the Ottoman world. Her research interests also include the 19th century decorative art in Europe and the Middle East, the history of Islamic manuscript practices, the politics of exhibiting and collecting Islamic art, global art historiography, design history, and theory. In addition to the arts of the book in Asia, she holds a PhD in art history from Binghamton University, State University of New York. Please help me in welcoming our speakers for today. So you have 20 minutes or so to...
So how we're going to run this by me speaking about the book so that you all become familiar with its main contents for 20 minutes or so. And then Jan and I will have a conversation about the book itself, and we'll leave the last 20 minutes of the session to questions from the audience that Bilal will be moderating.
Sure. You should use this, I guess. So.
Thank you, Bilal, for the introduction and for agreeing to do this. Thank you all for coming today. I'm very excited to see a full house. It makes me very happy. I also want to quickly remind you that tomorrow there will be the public lecture by Dr. Jan van der Putten on Southeast Asian book production in the 19th century. It's going to be in this room, but it's starting at 6, so from 6 to 7:30. Please, it's a rare occasion that we have somebody on campus working on Southeast Asia, and so it'll be an interesting perspective to see. I also want to thank the Center for Arts and Humanities, especially Rita Basil, for helping pull this together, my department, the Fine Arts and Art History Department, Kames, and of course Bilal and Jan for agreeing to do this today. So it's always difficult to put together a sort of introduction to the book after you've written it and spent many years with it and are pretty much sick of it. But I do want to get you excited about the topic itself, and what I thought would be best would be to show you what excited me about this topic before I took on the project. So the first part of my brief introduction will be talking to you about how this book came about and what questions I set out to explore in it. In the second part, I will show you some examples from the book and some of my observations related to the examples. The book is circulating, so some of the images in that book will be shown on the screen today. Okay, so the project itself began with my curiosity about the Arabic Protestant Bible. Maybe we can hit the lights, because most of it is black and white, so I mean, this is as good as it's gonna get. So this particular Bible was printed in various editions between 1860 and 1870. It was translated and published by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, Mission to Syria. And this particular mission was established in Beirut in the 1820s. The press itself was established in 1834. It originally existed at the ABCFM mission in Malta, but in 1834 it was moved here with the intention of it serving as a key Arabic publishing enterprise. And colloquially, it is known as Matba'a al-Amerikaniyya. So this is why I refer to it as the American press. Some scholars also refer to it as the American Mission Press. Though the Bible itself only saw its first edition come out in 1860, printing the Arabic Bible was always the original plan for this press. And that's why it was, at least that's how the mission positioned the role of this particular press. And it was supposed to be a part of the mission's proselytizing efforts in Ottoman Syria amongst the multi-confessional residents in Ottoman Syria. This, of course, was in addition to publishing secular and religious works for local Arabic speakers, and the mission included schools, churches, and of course the Syrian Protestant College, AUB campus that we've celebrated the 150 of this year. In the end, my book didn't focus on this specific publication. But in encountering this book's pages and history, various issues were raised for me, and they became central to my project. One thing was the seemingly simple or unremarkable visual layout of this specific book. So we see a very simple use of design elements, almost nondescript, with a focus on the text itself. And many people would say, well, this is what you would expect from a Protestant publication. I mean, the Protestants aren't known for being flamboyant, right? And so this is something that is par for the course, essentially, as part of a Protestant project. The other thing that struck me was the role of the American press itself, specifically its particular role as a publisher of Arabic print culture at a time when books were being produced through scribal methods and at various well-established workshops and institutions. So these were two questions that I found worth pursuing in my research. But when I first decided to pursue this, I was asked, why would I opt for Arabic print culture in the Ottoman world in the 19th century when there's a wealth of illustrated and illuminated manuscripts to choose from, even those that were produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, they're much more beautiful, there's much more ornamentation going on, there's much more illumination, and as an Islamic art historian, it makes a lot more sense to pursue a study of these specific books. Why opt for something that is mechanically reproduced, where the hand of the calligrapher and the illuminator is no longer present? So it's not surprising that traditionally the study of the Arabic book has been limited to manuscripts. And even more so, it tends to be limited to Islamic manuscripts, whereas in reality, we really have a wealth of manuscript production and calligraphic practices that exist outside of the Islamic scribal sphere. And so we see, particularly in the region of Ottoman Syria, a number of monasteries were also working on a number of manuscripts at the time, and scribal traditions were extremely important in the context of the Christian realm. Granted, the images that I'm showing you here, we're speaking about the more expensive, elaborate commissions, and not all manuscripts are visually pleasing. But Islamic art historians rarely take up the study of these less decorative examples, unless, of course, using them as historical evidence. So what these examples show us is that they speak to the prominence of the exchange of books, ideas, and visual traditions amongst the region's multi-confessional communities, as well as the centrality of scribal conventions to these different social groups. Unlike well-established manuscript traditions, Arabic printing in the Ottoman and Islamic worlds does not become prevalent until the 19th century. Although a number of low-budget presses operated on and off in the region since the 17th century, their output was rather limited, like the example that we see over here. Often, these presses relied on funding from a single entity or individual, so when the money ran out or the individual dies, the press shuts down. It was only during the late 1800s that the region really saw a proliferation of presses that were private presses that published books, journals, newspapers, and pamphlets at a time when various intellectual, economic, political, and social changes were taking place in the regional urban centers such as Beirut, Cairo, Alexandria, Istanbul, Damascus, Aleppo, and so on. This period, commonly known as al-Nahda al-Arabiya, the Arab Renaissance, which during the early to late 19th century also interfaced with the Ottoman Empire's Tanzimat, or a series of state-led reforms and modernization initiatives. As we know, intellectual discourses of the Nahda related to local Arab notions of modernity, such as Western education, secularism, and national identity, and gained popularity among the region's middle class and elites, particularly the newly formed class of merchants and intellectuals that emerged following the Ottoman Empire's immersion in the global capitalist market economy. Because print played an important role in the transmission and circulation of Nahda ideas, historical, bibliographic, and literary studies on Arabic printing emphasized the Arab press's later successes. Few of these scholars consider the Arab press's earlier period, so from the 1830s to the 1860s, when this missionary press was first operating in the region. Most scholarship on Nahda publishing, when I began work on this project, also attended to printed products through a purely textual lens, paying little attention to the aesthetic dimensions of these publications, their relationship to the art of regional manuscript production, and their conceptions of links between text and its visual manifestations on the page. So coming back to this Bible, in my project, I set out to illustrate, through art and design historical methods, the semiotic potential of seemingly bland, simple textual material by examining the typography, visual conventions, logic of organization, and other material aspects of early Arabic print culture. My argument for this approach is that questions of visual literacy and visuality are as important as textual analysis when trying to understand social views on books and reading practices. In seeking to understand the visual practices at this press, I turned to an exploration of its earlier publications, up until the time that the first Bible came off the press in 1860. Earlier works included a book on Arabic grammar by Nasif al-Yaziji, which first came off the press in 1836, and who at this time was employed as the mission's key press corrector and Arabic instructor. I realized that the first books printed at the American press between 1834 and 1840 looked very different from those of later years, which were produced in 1840 and onwards. In exploring the varying visual conventions between books like this one and the Mission's Bible of 1860, I felt that the important question to be asking was not how these visual changes came about, but why? And what could the dynamic design programs of these books tell us about the early forms, uses, and meanings of Arabic printing for multi-confessional regional intellectuals and readers during the 1800s? To answer these questions, I turned to a study of the ABCFM records, including annual reports, press reports, journal entries, and correspondences that are held at AUB, Harvard Libraries, the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, the British Library, and the Near East School of Theology in Beirut. I also conducted a close visual and textual reading of over 70 examples of the American press publications that were printed between 1836 and 1867. In this way, I analyzed the American press's publications within the complex web of missionary archival documents from these institutions. What I found was that the publications of this Protestant mission in its press's early phase from 1834 to the 1860s, in both their material, components, and textual content, negotiated responses to various local and external impulses that included pressure from the Missionary Board in Boston, changes in the region's religious and socio-political landscape, and shifting notions of the Arabic book among local Arab Christian and Muslim readers. More importantly, after examining works off this press, which included religious works as well as texts on Arabic grammar, literature, science, and poetry, it became clear that at some point during its operation, the press itself became an important publisher of non-missionary works that were funded by local Nahda period intellectuals and professionals. In fact, a number of these individuals, due to changes in the mission's policy towards its press in the 1850s, essentially helped to keep the press running by renting it to produce their own publications, which the mission referred to in their records as job works, that were used to offset the cost of maintaining the press and upgrading its equipment. Many of these scholars, such as Nasif al-Yaziji and Boutros al-Bustani, were authors, writers, and instructors who interacted with the mission's establishment as employees or members. Some of these Arab Syrian agents were also converts to Protestantism, such as Bustani, and also served as preachers and catechists. But the vast majority who utilized the American mission's press belonged to their own religious communities and oftentimes also served as Arabic instructors for the mission. Several of these individuals were trained in scribal conventions and used the press and print medium as a way to situate themselves as prominent intellectuals at a time when modes of knowledge production were shifting from those of scribal traditions to ones that now belong to a commercial publishing industry. Through their use of the press, these agents managed to publish and circulate their own volumes of grammar, poetry, history, science, and literature, as well as those of their friends and associates, in this way becoming editors and publishers themselves. And so what started as a study of the Protestant Bible turned into an earlier history of the American mission press in particular, and Arabic printing in general. My book then became a study of this missionary press's products, their visual and organizational conventions, and its regional significance to an emergent printing industry. So now I'll take you through some of the books themselves and some of my observations. And my findings. The main example that features in my book is this grammar by Nasif al-Yaziji, which is actually the first book that he published at this time. What I found most striking about this publication was how it spoke to the dynamic nature of early printed books as sites of artistic innovation and experimentation, where various local and external aesthetic impulses converged. The book's layout and compositions recall multiple aspects of illuminated manuscripts. Introductory two-page spreads. The two-page spread brings to mind the incipit pages of local manuscripts, which featured embellished introductions and dedications, such as the sarlah, or the ornamental headpiece, borders of rosettes and palmettes and flora, as well as catchwords that you see at the bottom, which emulated systems in place to help collators organize the sequence of manuscript folia and quires. And what's interesting about these early printed books is that catchwords appear alongside page numbers. So it's kind of odd that you have these two systems in place in these early books. In this book, we also see the use of the Bismillah Tughra, not uncommon for local manuscripts of poetry or historical chronicles that were copied by Christian scribes at this time. What's interesting about the Tughra is that it calls out to a long tradition in the Ottoman realm of calligraphy. And this tradition was initially reserved for imperial monograms since the Mamluk period. And by the 1800s, this motif is standardized in the imperial context. And it also begins to appear in the secular realm via lawhas with benedictions, such as the one you see on the screen. The Tughra's use here in Yazdi's book was no doubt a nod to this contemporary calligraphic trend at the time. What's interesting is that we see the similar visual compositions in most of the press's works from this period. We even see it in seemingly less significant products like pamphlets or ephemera. So here you're looking at a book that is essentially just 6 pages, and it's a treatment on cholera that was given out for free, and it was printed in 1836. And what's interesting is that you see the same manuscript conventions and the same kind of aesthetic effort here in this particular book that essentially is not a book. It's just literally 6 pages. The emulation of some scribal conventions in these publications was not only a matter of co-opting such practices in an exclusive manner. What is evident when studying the layouts of these books and what speaks to the truly experimental nature of printing at this time is the fact that inspirations were culled from myriad sources, local and global. For instance, Yazdi's title page is clearly fashioned along the similar graphic arrangement to that of John Johnson's Typographia that was printed in London in 1828 and was a very popular printer's guide at this time. It's unclear what the inclusion meant for Yazdi or the mission at the time, and I don't think there was a broad ideological concern here when including. I think it was a practical matter of something that they liked, and they had a copy of Johnson's Typographia in the print shop. That's probably mostly the case. But what's interesting about this example is that it shows us how these publications were engaging with broader global printing practices and visual trends. And perhaps this was a way in which they were attempting to locate their books within the nexus of modern trends and traditional practice. Emulating scribal conventions in the realm of print at the time was rather common, and it was a practice adopted in varied ways across regional printing establishments. We can see similar practices and publications from the Imperial Press in Bula in Cairo, which was essentially the first Arabic printing press in the region. And here we're seeing also the presence of marginalia, readings and interpretations as exegesis that was not used in the American press, where they tend to use footnotes instead. And so this was a common practice in manuscripts, of course, where interpretations, readings, and explanations were included as marginal commentary by prominent scholars, and then essentially were canonized by being incorporated into each subsequent copy of the same manuscript. Again, what I found intriguing about these conventions at the American press was their inconsistency. By the 1840s and 1850s, the books printed at this press no longer shared much with their scribal counterparts. As shown earlier, the second edition of Yazdi's grammar is a far cry from the one we just saw, featuring a decorative arch and ornamental borders. The same goes for the opening pages, which, while still designed, only show a few traces of manuscript conventions, such as the tapering of the text and the minimal use of borders and elements, framing elements. And this change was not unique to this particular publication. I found that every single work that was printed after 1842 no longer followed the manuscript-like aesthetic of books from the 1830s. Reading these books alongside an examination of missionary sources from this period, I was able to come up with a number of theories to explain this development. One relates to the new typeface that was used. By 1842, the mission had acquired a new set of type that they claimed was much more streamlined and aesthetically pleasing than the previous typeface that was used. So you see the two typefaces here. But the change in typeface was not enough to explain why scribal conventions were abandoned. Looking at missionary records, I found that the mission's policy in the 1830s was one of casting a wide net by trying to avoid any antagonizing local Christian communities. And this policy was essentially adopted after a few incidents in the 1820s when the missionaries faced opposition from local Christian communities for indiscriminately circulating Arabic translations of Protestant literature and Bibles that were printed in London that local communities found to be rather controversial. And so at this time, the missionaries managed to alienate and aggravate the Maronite and Greek Orthodox patriarchs, among others, who called for the burning of Protestants' books and not attending their schools. In my book, I suggest that the emulation of scribal practices, which display a sense of religious ambiguity, if you will, emerged at a time when the missionaries were hoping to salvage ties with local communities and to rectify their earlier failings. This ambiguity was also present in the textual content and subject matter. For instance, most of these works dealt with either secular subject matter, like grammars and books on arithmetic, or a genre of literature that reflected what I would call a restrained evangelism. For instance, books on morality and religious narratives. But this did not explain why these visual conventions were abandoned in the 1840s and 1850s in favor for a more streamlined aesthetic. Again, turning to the mission sources and local developments, I noted that many changes were occurring internally at the level of the mission and externally in the region and with the missions board at home. One was the message from the board in Boston that the press, along with the mission's other institutions like their schools, should no longer be central goals. Rufus Anderson, the board secretary at the time, explicitly blamed the mission schools and presses in all of the ABCFM's establishments globally for the poor conversion numbers. He argued that the missionaries' aim was to take to the pulpit and that preaching was the missionaries' main calling. To ensure this, funding was cut to the press, and any books that were to be printed needed to go through a more elaborate approval process. This meant that there could no longer be a lot of funding and time spent on visual compositions, such as the one you see in the previous examples. But instead of abandoning the press completely, the Syria mission found a way around these restrictions by arguing that competing missions, specifically Catholic, the Catholic ones, and like the Jesuits and the Franciscans, I'm almost out of time, were setting up their own presses and using books to attract potential converts. The Americans managed to maintain the press by printing books and pamphlets that were much more aggressive in their tone, ones that criticized practices of the Catholic Church and those of local churches. What they also did was rely more heavily upon external funding to keep the press running and to procure the funds needed to print their religious literature. This is when, as I mentioned earlier, the missionaries allowed local scholars or aspiring writers to rent their press, labor, and equipment to produce their own books, which were referred as job works. The press also began to more visibly advertise its new typeface, which became a successful money-making venture for a number of decades. What I found particularly interesting was how these so-called job works looked. Instead of clearly emulating scribal conventions, as their contemporaries did at other regional presses in Egypt and Iran, they stuck with the mission's simpler aesthetic and conventions. But as I argue in my book, the use of the American press's conventions was not simply a matter of employing practices already in place at the press. Instead, I suggest that there was more of a conscious picking and choosing going on by these emergent editors and publishers. Specifically, they chose to feature specific elements that recalled scribal traditions, such as the stukhra that we saw earlier, while abandoning others, such as catchwords, headpieces, and decorative borders. What I found significant about the stukhra was how it shows that these local agents were negotiating their fluctuating perceptions of traditional practice or scribal conventions and modernity, in this case, Western notions of book production and publishing in the realm of print. In fact, a number of these publications show a rather dynamic experimental attitude towards printing conventions at a time when notions of the book were being renegotiated in the face of the transition from scribal economy to a printing one. This illustrates an emergent notion amongst the print intelligentsia in Beirut at the time of what printed text should look like, particularly how such books should bring together the still revered Arabic calligraphic traditions with a growing interest in modernity and its aesthetics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This is fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No. So I have some PowerPoint images prepared for our conversation.
I don't know how it's going to work out because we haven't had any practice yet. So this is impromptu.
Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, let me thank AUB, Hala, and Bilal and the Center of Humanities for inviting me here and giving me this very exciting and nice opportunity to be here and to having received the opportunity of reading Hala's wonderful book. It is exciting. I don't want to be too broad and too long because it's all about Hala's book. And I think there are two very general things that have made me very excited about this. One is the art historian take on it, talking about visual literacy and visual epistemology, which is looking at printed texts from a different type or from a different angle than I as a textual scholar are used to, and I'm dealing with texts from Southeast Asia, but most of the content, focusing on the content, but it is exciting in book history to look at how these texts are framed, how readers go into the text, and what kind of threshold, if we want to use Jeanette's terminology, they have to pass before going to this text. So that is exciting, and it is very broad, right? Of course, book history has thrived these past decades, but most, again, as always, looking at books being produced in Europe, not so much in the Arabic world, and let alone in Southeast Asia. So for me, this is one very exciting thing. The other thing is the historical. My field of expertise or inquiry is Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian literature. I knew of the Nahda, of the Renaissance, reformist Islam, etc. But this missionary press and the thrust of development that it made or brought into being has a lot of similarities with Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, the role of ABCFM, so the American Board of Christian Foreign Missionaries, and also London Missionary Society, introduced printing, not introduced, but in the early 19th century had some print shops, which triggered in Singapore and one or two other centers, urban centers in Southeast Asia, a thriving Islamic lithographic print industry. From that, early 20th century reformist Islam, very much in connection to Egypt, Abduh and Ridho and others, Jamaluddin. Reformist Islam, very much into printing, expanded their influence and made or established two big organizations. One, Nahdlatul Ulama, the more traditionalist, and the other one, Muhammadiyah, which both are, up to the present, huge, the biggest Islamic organizations in Indonesia. They have millions of members. So this whole trigger of reformist Islam and what kind of developments it triggered are maybe there are many similarities with what Hala has showed us in her book. So that is two very exciting and very broad perspectives which I found extremely interesting in reading in this book. Now I have prepared some more general questions for Hala. One of which is what happened to the manuscript economy and the local written traditions. Again, where I come from, not Hamburg, but Southeast Asia, you see, first of all, lithography coming in, which has a direct link with manuscript culture. I mean, these texts were written on stone or in Greece on stone and then printed. You see letterpress afterwards taking over, and you see manuscript copying continuing. What you also see is that to a large extent that these manuscript copies, these new copies, they emulate the newly produced books. So I'm very interested in what happened here to the textual production in manuscript form, and also in the role of lithography, because you discuss lithography in the book, but American press, for some reason, didn't really be active agents in this developing of lithography here. Because what you discuss in your book is they wanted large print runs and cheaper books through letterpress printing. What you see in Southeast Asia is that these missionaries, from the same missionary board, used lithography rather than letterpress printing. So please give us some information about this.
Thank you for that question. And it allows me to bring in an aspect that I do touch on in my book, but I don't elaborate on as much. Well, regarding traditional modes of book production in the region, I know that AUB itself has copies of 20th century manuscripts, so manuscript practices do continue. But it seems, I mean, I haven't done a great study of this, but it seems that it becomes very particular. So you see a lot of liturgical works being produced through manuscript conventions, where AUB has copies of Syriac literature from the Maronite Church. We also see a lot of manuscript production in more illicit publications. So I know that there's a lot of erotic publications that are produced in manuscript form in a way to sort of avoid censorship from the press. But to my knowledge, manuscripts do continue to be produced into the 20th century. They just take on a different type of significance in relationship to what they were like prior to printing at the time. But certainly the calligraphic tradition is still strong today. But again, it's now more on a sort of a marginal artistic practice. It's no longer part of book production or knowledge production per se. But you still see that kind of a hierarchy that's established in scribal workshops, and you could still trace your lineage to important calligraphers of the past if you follow certain schools in calligraphy. When it comes to lithography, for some reason, the ABCFM didn't use it in Beirut. I know that when they first moved from Malta to Beirut, they had two presses. They had two lithographic presses. And these presses were explicitly there to produce works in Syriac and Arabic. And the idea was, yes, it makes the most sense because they're using it in Iran for the same purposes. It translates best for scribal conventions. And if you want to produce books that locals are going to be okay with, then it would make sense to utilize this practice. The presses that arrive in Beirut are both broken, or when they first arrive, and only one is fixed. But even after it's repaired, they insist on the use of letterpress. Nothing in the records tells us why. But when they do use the lithographic press at the mission, they use it to print maps and to print large format spelling cards for the classrooms. And this goes against the regional conventions when it comes to lithography. So, I mean, if we look at some examples, lithographic printing was used. I mean, it makes so much sense when it comes to illustrated Persian manuscripts of the Shahnameh and other, the Skandarnameh here, and other important books that essentially there was a period in the 1860s where all of the traditional Persian manuscripts were being copied in lithograph form, and this was a major practice. Oftentimes, some of these copies would be colored in. That was a common practice. The uncolored versions are not the common practice. It's interesting, in one of these manuscripts, you see an illustration of the lithographic practice. So it was celebrated as a technology. And although they had letterpress printing in Iran, they preferred to use lithography. You also see it what's interesting about it is, again, with the marginalia, how it creates a sort of aesthetic forms using the margins. You can find there are so many of these works out there. You also see lithographic printing in Cairo. So although letterpress printing is common, even at Bulat Press, you also have lithographic printing. And some examples I've looked at, even into the 20th century, they combine both technologies. So parts of the text would be lithographed, other parts would be letterpress printed. So it's much more symbiotic when it comes to the use of this technology in association with lithographic printing, with letterpress printing. For the American press itself, I don't know why. I have no answer for that. But one of my theory that I would say I would subscribe to is that they had a preconceived attitude towards lithography, that it's supposed to be used in advertisements, for posters, for these large format types text, and so it's not meant for books. This might be one thing. At the same time, missionaries did own books from other presses, so they knew that this practice was in place at other presses, which makes me wonder whether they did not have the skill, the labor at the time to produce these kinds of works. I really don't know, but what's interesting for me is that in Beirut and for the Nahda, what becomes more popular is letterpress printing. And all the journals that come out during the Nahda period, all of them are printed on letterpress. None of them are printed via lithographic methods. So lithography then becomes relegated to a specific type of book production, books that are maqamat al-hariri or diwan al-mutanabbi, things that are more traditionally part of the classic genre of Arabic literature, where the more modern examples of Arabic literature and scientific inquiry would be printed via letterpress. Does this mean it was perceived as something that is more modernized than lithographic printing? That would be something I would suggest. But again, I have no evidence to back this up. Maybe people in the audience know more than me about this, but this is my understanding. Maybe Bilal,
It's very interesting. I mean, in Southeast Asia, there's one Reverend Cleesbury who takes up his lithographic printing and develops it. He has a background in India where there was a thriving lithographic presses. I mean, not only in Persia, but especially in Lucknow and other places. And you see that he develops it further and very floral, although very Protestant, but lots of illuminations, very traditional, but very Indian characterized, with very Indian-like sense about it. But it seems to be very personal. So it could be that here in Beirut there was what you just said. There was nobody who could do that. So it can be very personal, right? These are 2, 3, 4 missionaries who all have their own talents, they all have their own things going on, and historical contingencies we also must somehow factor in this.
Well, actually, if I can interrupt you to add to that, what's actually interesting about the American mission is that the people who were working at the press were not the missionaries, especially early on. They did not hire, none of them spoke Arabic. So you had one missionary who spoke Arabic or claims to know Arabic, and everybody else was a local hire, and they were all trained in scribal conventions. They all came from scribal systems. So and when they were producing books, like Nasif al-Yaziji's book, for instance, it would go through several manuscript versions before it gets set and typed. So you know that people on site know calligraphic rules and producing manuscripts. Why they didn't translate this to lithography is unusual if you think about it in the broader context. And so,
well, to a certain extent, I think some of these missionaries they have an idea about traditional knowledge production, and then they formalize it, and this is the way. So they are more conventional than the local people because they change, they get more ideas from all over the... It's interesting that you say the Nahda is all in letterpress printing. If I recall correctly, then in the early 20th century, everything that comes out of these reformist Muslims in Southeast Asia is all letterpress, nothing in lithography. So what is interesting here as well is we think of, okay, this is American missionary board coming here, sending missionaries, and they are going to change the whole thing through the press, right? This is the most important thing. The letterpress is coming in, and the missionaries are driving this. But in your book, you sketch a big role of people like al-Yazidi and al-Bustani. So whose press was this? Was it the missionaries who led the development, or was it the local people who led the development?
Sorry, Bilal.
That's okay.
So initially I assumed that this was the mission's press, that much of the work was being done by members of the mission. But then, looking really closely at the records, when you see who's actually employed there and who's doing all the work, it's all locals at every single level. And really, like I said, Eli Smith was, at least until he dies in 1857, he was the only person who was involved in the press who spoke Arabic and read Arabic and was able to converse in Arabic. And most of the time, he was not even in the country. And so the people who were running the press were local individuals who were hired for various reasons. They weren't hired, the ones that were, a little bit higher on the tier were not hired just to be members of the press. They were doing other things for the mission, and they were asked to produce content. So one of the concerns of the missions was, we want to produce so many books, and we want to translate so many books, but they don't have people, they don't know how to do it because they don't have language acquisition skills. So they needed to hire Arabic instructors, which is what they did. But acquiring Arabic was taking a lot longer than they expected. And so these Arabic instructors were then asked to write material. But in writing material, they also were producing their own work that then they go on to sell on their own, and Yaziji ends up funding his book, even though the press produced it initially for use at the seminary. And so from very early on, I would say this was the local scholars' press, in the sense that, unofficially in that sense. But then by 1850, when the mission can no longer fund any of the projects, it really does become a private press that is rented out by local individuals. And in some of the examples that I've seen, it's not clear whether the books, they're not explicitly, the press is not explicitly stated as the American press, but based on the visual conventions and the typefaces used and the time period and whether this publisher had his own press or not, it's clear that they were printed at the American press. So it becomes an unintentional, unofficial secular publisher, an important part of the Nahda. But it's all unofficial, and this is not something they were communicating to the American board in Boston. This was something they were keeping on the down low when it comes to Beirut. They were just saying, well, we have all these great books that we're selling, we're making so much money off of this. But in reality, for instance, so there's press catalogs. Looking at some later press catalogs, I've recently been working on this material from the 1890s. The press catalogs basically tell you exactly what this press's function is. They're trying what they're selling. They're selling the different printing modes. They print in the electrotype. They're lithographers. They're type founders. They were selling all the images and illustrations that people were using in the journals. And so, I mean, their role takes on a very commercial. It goes towards the commercial side, and they're really trying to make a profit off of the Nahda period. So they were involved in its early inception, and then they were trying to monetize their involvement in it later on in the 19th century.
You also in your book, and you just said it as well. You talk about the missionary press selling. It's a beautiful letterpress, beautiful font typeface, which they made in Leipzig and had made in Leipzig, and then copied in Beirut, and then other presses ordered it and they sold it. Right? That is what I got from your book. You just said all the Nahda, or quite a few of these Nahda prints were made at this missionary press. But how do you know if there's no title page, or title page is not mentioning the printer, how do you know that the missionary press did it? And that brings me also to the other question, more general one, a title page. You showed us Johnson's and Al-Yazizi's title page, which only has the title on it. And it has a beautiful gate, and well, in Arabic it's al-bab, the gateway to the book. And also in Japanese, in Southeast Asia, you have this gapura, the gate to inside the book. Could you, from a visual aspect, how does it frame readers to go into the book, this type of title page?
Well, the first part of your question about the different presses that were using this typeface. The reason it's possible to trace which presses use which the typeface is because there are letters, Arabic letters going back and forth between the press itself and local individuals. So when you have letters, basically you know that they were purchasing typefaces from the press. But towards the end of the 19th century, other presses were producing typefaces as well, and so there was more competition in that sense. But early on, a lot of presses used the American typeface, even the Jesuit press, which was the Protestant mission's main competition in Beirut. They were using the American typeface for a long period of time before they developed their own typeface. And so it's not that easy to trace if you don't have correspondence. Then you turn to a sort of a visual analysis, which is what I do in some of the examples. And the fact that, sometimes somebody prints a book, but they don't have a press at that time, because it looks aesthetically like the American press's publications, I would assume that it was printed at the American press. But it's actually rather well known that the American typeface was probably, in addition to the Protestant Bible, these were probably the more successful aspects of the mission itself. Not counting AUB. But AUB is a funny enterprise because from its inception, the Syrian Protestant College was seen as something that's different from the press. It was not from the mission. It was not funded by missionary sources, so it's not like the press in that case. When it comes to the title page, to my knowledge, there aren't printed books that don't have title pages. And I know you mentioned that sometimes initially that printed books would not have title pages, but from the earliest examples from the 1600s and the 1700s, there's always been a title page involved. And I mean, obviously in the manuscript tradition, title pages are sometimes added on, right, by collectors. It's not necessarily a part of the book from its inception, right? It sometimes could be added on later on. In the examples that I've looked at, the title pages vary. The initial pages, title pages, sometimes they would not include the date or the publisher, and that would come in the colophon at the end of the book. You see minimal information on some of them. But very early on, title pages emulate the frontispieces of manuscripts, the use of carpet pages, for instance. You see this very frequently in lithography and also in letterpress printing. But oftentimes, again, the date is not necessarily included. Now, Elizabeth Eisenstein has argued that the inclusion of the title page is the way in which the print culture was being commodified, right? And presses, and it becomes more important for presses and publishers to clearly identify what they have for sale and to identify themselves with certain publications. And this is something that you start to see, but I would say early on, even if a press is not listed, the aesthetic conventions of the books you can easily identify them with specific presses in the region. And I think of it as an early example of marketing, of promoting the press and the kinds of aesthetics that it produces and the kinds of books that it produces through the aesthetics of the title page, even if the name of the publisher is not listed on the press. Obviously, with the missions that we're printing at the time, they clearly label what kind of books they're producing, and the Jesuits, you make no mistake that this is a Jesuit publication. I mean, this is the Bible title page, but even with works that were not religious in nature, they included their insignia. It was very clear that this is a Jesuit publication. The same goes for the publications by the Church Mission Society, the British Society in Malta. They also clearly located their works and positioned their works within a particular religious framework and Protestant framework. So a reader coming to this book knows what to expect when looking at this book. With the American press, it was a little bit more ambiguous initially. So, like you see in Yazdi's example, yes, the publisher is not listed in this book. In most of the early publications by the American Mission, almost all of them actually, the press is not named on the title page, and it's not named in the colophon either. And I think this was a way to kind of, avoid the kind of antagonism that they were facing at the time from local religious communities. Later on, though, in the 1860s and 1870s, you start to see a more standardized use of title pages. And again, this is when the publishing industry is becoming more competitive and where people are starting to position themselves as members of this emergent intelligentsia and locating their work in this context. And so you start to see a more prominent use of title pages where their names are listed, the funders are listed, the presses are listed, and dates and what have you. That fits more with Western practices at this time.
The author becoming important and being placed on the title page is of a later stage, right? At the beginning, it was a publisher or a printer that wanted to sell books, and like Eisenstein or one of the others also said, it's for book catalogs and bookshops that they clearly can see formatting and grouping books together from title pages and such. Then you showed the beautiful basmala in the Tugra form, and this is one thing that I'm unfamiliar with from Southeast Asia, but I know it from Turkey, and I know it's very much identified as the Sultan and royal seal and royal names. So seeing it as a basmala was surprising for me, but like you said in your talk, it's in calligraphic manuscript, it is not uncommon. But still, I want to ask you some more details about how you see this in these books. Was it a clear sign towards the Ottoman Empire? Was it identified totally with the Ottoman Empire and the royal house? Or was it more coming of a common feature of books? Or is it just missionary book and etc.? So I'd like to hear more about that.
So this is the Bismillah that you're mentioning. So these are the examples that I see it appear in. So there's this book, this one, and then a number of others so far.
In your book, you also described it that it's cut out of a
Lead.
Yeah. A block. So it's one block, which everywhere is the same. So it should be the same dimensions everywhere.
And the thing is, it could be the same exact block that is being shared, or it could be copied. I mean, you can't tell whether.
It's hand carved.
Yeah, but it could be hand carved by somebody else.
Yeah, then no exact copy.
Well, yeah, I haven't gone through and actually, studied it like measurements and what have you. But generally, it seems to be the same piece because it only appears in books that, and so far, I mean, I could be wrong, but so far what I've seen, it only appears in books and pamphlets that have some ties to the American press. And it doesn't mean that it's only used at the American press. It could have been shared widely, but by the groups of individuals who would have been members of or friends with people who worked at the press. When it comes to this Torah form itself, it was not common to printing. It's not as common as other forms, other calligraphic forms, but it was very much an imperial symbol. You see it on buildings, you see it on postage stamps, you see it on seals. This would have been something they encountered in their everyday lives. And so it's definitely something that would have been very understood to be a part of the Ottoman imperial tradition. In the 1800s, towards the late 1700s, Mustafa Rakim uses it in a way where it becomes more prevalent in a more secular context through the use of benedictions on lawhas and what have you. So it becomes something that you see in other aspects of everyday life, material culture. But I would say, and this is something I don't explicitly say in the book, but now having looked at this and other symbols, I would say it is very much about how these non-Muslim Arab Syrians were perhaps trying to locate themselves within the broader constructs of empire, and as now being identified as Ottoman subjects, particularly after the Tanzimat and after the emergence of the first constitutional period. And I wonder whether this symbol was a way for them to sort of either reaffirm their allegiance to the Sultan or to try to bypass censorship, which was also becoming an issue, or was it just a way in which they were negotiating their position as Ottoman subjects? I don't know, but I would think that plays into it, probably more than I emphasize in my book. I think that's really what they were doing in this through their use of this Torah in the books.
Well, Yan and Hala, I'm afraid that we're running out of time, and the discussion shows that the book opens the door for a lot of questions and discussions, and I would like to take a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind. Okay, Alia.
So I have two questions.
If you could ask yourself, because I'm honest now.
Did you come across any elements, or are you interested in looking at elements in these books that tell us anything about the reading practices?
The what?
The reading practices during this
Okay.
period? And the second question, if I understood well, there's a gradual transition between the scribal tradition and the print culture that happened through the use of the catchwords and the page numbers. So did these old traditions, like the catchwords or the commentaries in the margin, gained a different function or meaning? So, or did they just stay because they were older traditions, part of the manuscript traditions, and they kept on just appearing in these manuscripts and then gradually disappeared?
Yeah, I mean, your second part of your question. I really don't know why catchwords appear alongside page numbers. It absolutely makes no sense because they were only used to collate manuscripts. It doesn't make sense when you have, a quire. You have you print the book in a way that it is not the same way that you produce manuscripts. And so I do think that it is a convention that is expected by the reader, and it's a convention that these traces of the scribal elements that remain for reasons beyond practicality, for reasons beyond how one would read the text when it comes to catchwords. Marginalia, the use of footnotes really does not become prominent in manuscripts until after print emergence regionally. And in the printed examples that use footnotes, it really is only the first time that I see footnotes is in American press products, where it makes sense perhaps because the people supervising were like, well, this is how we do it. We don't include text on slants and diagonals. But the example that I showed from Bula, what's interesting about it is that it's really difficult to set type along a diagonal. And so even in practices that are not lithographic, you still see this emphasis and this insistence upon marginalia. And there's nothing new in that, including this, in my understanding. That this is still a way in which knowledge production is understood and is continued from the scribal traditions. And what you don't see in print is all the manuscript work that goes into place initially. I mean, for example, if you go to Nest and you look at their Bible collections of their manuscripts, there are at least 3 copies of each volume of the Bible in manuscript form. The first would be the translations, and there would be 2 versions of that. There'd be the translations are taking place in the manuscript form. One person would be translating translating the text, the other would be correcting it, and then somebody would copy it, and then someone would copy it with corrections. So you have these manuscripts. And then there's a manuscript that's produced with the inclusion of the footnotes and how the book is supposed to look like when it's printed. And so what we don't talk about when we talk about print in the region is how manuscript traditions are continued at the press, even though they don't often make their way to the printed work itself. It's very late in the 19th century when marginalia is abandoned. It continues. So I mean, I think it's a part of local reading practices. It's an important aspect of it, and maybe those who were turning to footnotes were intentionally trying to break with these conventions. They're trying to make a mark upon local book culture and readership by saying that this is different, this is new, we're breaking with these conventions intentionally, and not just simply following Western conventions.
There was a question here.
Two things. Was there a bibliography of everything that was published in a certain period of time? I'm not familiar with the book, so I'm interested in seeing what kind of literature was actually published other than the religious one. We saw a few in relation to Mahmoud Bastani and the teaching of language and yazidi. And I was noticing that there was a lot of discrepancy also. Sometimes they put the Harakat and sometimes they don't. And since I'm a very big fan of Harakat, I'm interested in seeing if there's anything in relation to that. And thirdly, I'm always fascinated by the notion of copyright, of presses at that time. يعني مثلا شفنا شيء للمتنبي. Okay, إنه أشرف على متوسطين قال إنه he just wants to publish الديوان تبع المتنبي. You just do that. You talk to somebody? How do you address issues of what is allowed to be published and what isn't? Or is that an irrelevant question? Because I'm interested in content selection.
Yazji also published Mutanabbi. Yazji also published Mutanabbi.
Yeah, yeah.
لا بس هي شو ما كيف في مبدأ حتى
نسيت شو كان أول سؤال؟ what your first question was. Can you repeat that? Sorry.
First question was
List some books.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, for bibliographies, we do have 19th and early 20th century texts that tell us what was published at which press. And what's also a good source for this kind of information is the press catalogs. So.
Anything directed towards children, other than a few things we saw about explaining the Bible, for instance, or mainly religious texts?
No. The American press, the minor publications were the religious texts. Most of their works were not religious in nature. I mean, they really pushed the Bible, and they would, in their press catalogs, for instance, they would have an entire page devoted to, these are the Bibles that we sell in various volumes and what have you. But the rest of the publications were scientific in nature, were literary in nature. All the job works that were produced by external members, so at their expense, right? So, the Sarqis brothers would come and they would publish their books at the press at their expense. The press would take some of these copies and then sell them themselves for their own benefit, which is interesting. So they did that a lot. They also, Al-Muqtataf was first published at the American press for several years until the editors leave due to the Darwin issues in the 1880s. Al-Tabib was published at the American press throughout its duration. And so they did publish works that were not religious. And I would argue that that's what made them important as a publisher, not the religious works.
So you would call them a publisher and not just the press, because there is a difference, right? Like in the sense of I come to you and you print my manuscript, or I am a publisher or an editor and I have a selection of things I would like to publish under it. And there's always that interesting thing for me in that era whereby presses are also publishers and vice versa. So you would call them publishers.
Yeah, but the thing is, what's funny is that they would even publish works that went against the mission. So they would, they did, not a lot of them read Arabic, right? And not a lot of them were really concerned with the workings of the press. But when they did publish material that was not part of the mission's goals, they wouldn't highlight that in the letters that they wrote back to Boston or in their annual reports. They would dismiss the publication as, a history of Mount Lebanon by a native. And that would be, an important text that they would just kind of gloss over. What's interesting is, for instance, when it comes to Al-Muqtataf, the speech of Edwin Lewis on Darwin was translated into Arabic and printed in Al-Muqtataf. And so it's funny that this kind of overlap that occurs. When it comes to, you were talking about vowel marks, right, vocalization marks. This was something that the American mission was really pushing as an important thing that's absolutely necessary for Arabic and absolutely necessary for the Bible. And this is how they ended up getting funding for the electrotyping of plates for the first runs of the Bible. They said that in order for Muslims to read this text, and this is what they wrote in their published circulars, in order for Muslims to read the text, it has to be vocalized because the Quran is vocalized, and this is what needs to happen. Whereas everybody knew that that's not the case, but that's how they raised funds. By pushing for vocalizing. Rana Isa is not here, but she argues this in her work on the Bible and how it was commodified regionally. But yes, what I found was in secular publications, the use of vocalization marks was often limited to direct translations of, like, in Diwan al-Mutanabbi or, Maqamat al-Hariri or any kind of anthology, when it's not the work of a contemporary scholar, it's sometimes included in full vocalization marks, and when it's a commentary or a work of a contemporary scholar, it's not fully vocalized. But this is something that is not consistent. But but voweling was important for the mission for a specific purpose.
We had a question from Nadia, and then there.
Thank you so much. It's been very, very
Marginalia reminded me actually of Brinkley Messick's book, The Calligraphic State, where he talks about basically the shift from the that was sort of written to the typeset without asking you to have written a different book, but a lot of what he's saying is also about a streamlining of authority that happens through both the printing and writing practices, but also in the reading practices. So just, I'm not exactly sure what I'm asking, but I'm maybe interested in your reflections on what that might mean about the kind of authority that the missionaries, even if they weren't necessarily producing the texts that were coming out of the printing press themselves, but the kind of authority that they may have been wanting to assume, but also the way in which knowledge as authority, or written knowledge as authority, starts to become a big part of pedagogical practices in education during this period.
Yeah, I would say that the continued use of marginalia at certain presses for certain books is about this, is about authenticating this text and legitimizing it and making it, and this question of authority, is important here, because we're working in a climate where the ulama still are the gatekeepers of knowledge, more or less, and this is a small group that gets larger, but a small group of non-Muslim minorities who are producing works and trying to interface with these traditions that have long been a part of Islamic knowledge production, and they've had no place in this lineage, and they're inserting themselves into it. And so in the use of marginalia in that sense, and I would even argue the use of the stuhra, for instance, is an attempt at accessing that kind of authority and lending that kind of authority to their publications. For the mission, what they focused on was the script that they believed conforms best to calligraphy. So their script itself, they've argued that it's their American typeface was so authentic and based on the true models from the East, and this was really what lends their work authority, along with the vocalization. They didn't see the use of marginalia as something that lent authority, or the use of certain visual elements.
Yeah, because the marginalia eventually disappears.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It also disappears from manuscripts.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
But also, like what you were saying about there's 3 different versions before that you were saying when you go to Nest, right? I mean, the marginalia is also about the discussion that's happening among the scholars, among the ulama, among sort of researchers, and all of that also disappears. And footnotes, no matter what, don't actually replicate that kind of dialectic.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, what the problem with printing is that you're not sure that this author to copyist authentication system is still in place. But it was still in place at these presses, because you could see it. But because you could see the manuscripts that are there, you could see the many versions of the copies that these manuscripts went through. And in the records, in the press records, they explain the process, the elaborate process of authenticating the text between the copyist and the author and the editor, and how the back and forth occurs.
So what was the
before.
print run? Speaking of it, what was the print run? Do we know the print run? How many books did they publish?
They, generally speaking, the more successful books were 2,000 copies would be printed. Yazaji's book was probably one of the most successful published at the press. It went through at least 6 editions, and each edition was 2,000 copies. And that's what people bought the most of. Other books, such as, for instance,
You mean the grammar book?
the grammar.
Yeah.
But also his
Textbook.
Majma' al-Bahrain was also, and then you see it being published at other presses. So his son Ibrahim al-Yaziji worked with the Jesuits, and he probably had his father's book published posthumously at the Jesuit press. So although Majma' al-Bahrain became popular as an American press publication, it then gets promoted in
We
different
have a
presses.
question from the young man.
Yeah.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I'm interested in the experimentation that you described, and how some of these visual practices come about and then disappear really fast. I'm wondering if either in correspondence or in the books themselves, there's any evidence of them responding to readers' tastes or to their audience. Like, do some of these
idea. Honestly, there's no discussion of design or aesthetics in any of the records. The closest we get, again, is typeface and this interest in the typeface. But although there's a clear visual difference between books before 1842 and books after 1842, there's no mention in the press records of why these changes occurred and was this a response to anything. The most I can say about the illustrations or the images is you start to see more experimentation later on in the 19th century in journals. And then you start to see a currency of certain images, and you see certain images repeating and certain images falling out of use. And maybe that can tell us a little bit about the reception of certain images. But as we know, the journals themselves, they never had the reader in mind, right? These books were produced by a coterie, as a small group of publishers and editors and writers who were producing the books for each other. And they didn't care who read the books. I mean, in the end, it wasn't about making money off of this. They were failed enterprises, if you want. I mean, a lot of these relied on subsidies from different societies. Otherwise, they would not be able to be produced. And that's what all of these books were produced through subsidies. So, I mean, I have no idea. But what you can say is, if you look towards the end of the 19th century, you start to see a prevalence of certain aesthetics and an abandonment of other aesthetics. So maybe that can tell us something about the reception.
I mean, just one quick example from my research. In the Maghrebi context,
Mm-hmm.
the first books are printed with the same typefaces, and they're not printed for commercial purposes. But every now and then, when somebody wants to print something popular, like Shambi, they then develop a specific typeface that looks more like the Maghrebi script. And that's how they're trying, I don't support this, but that's how they're trying to make it look more accessible to a number of people. Otherwise, they just use that and they assume that nobody's going to read it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't, I mean, the use of the image that I show here, the lion, it's just so random. It has nothing to do with I never see it again, and it's very distinct. Similar images appear in issues of Al-Muqtataf as part of the scientific discussion of nature and what have you. But I mean, these kinds of images, and I looked at the text in Muwashahat al-Andalusiya, and there is some reference to Amir Bashir Shab as a lion Asad, right? So I think that probably is it was made as a sort of tribute to Bashir Shab, and perhaps this is the role that this image plays. So I don't think it was about attracting audiences as much as it was about locating their work within a larger trajectory.
Dr. Dishon?
Could you talk a little bit about the role of the liturgy and the censorship and the selection of publications?
Could you repeat what you said? Sorry.
So you talked about the role of the liturgy or the censorship and the Ottoman censorship in the selection of publications.
Well, what I understood from the press records is that for the Ottoman Press Bureau, they weren't as strict until Abdul Hamid's period, until 1876. And that's when you start to get the need for, you need to send every single publication that comes off your press for approval at the Press Bureau. Before then, you just needed a rukhsa, right, to publish whatever works that you were publishing. But granted, they were not allowed to publish materials that were explicitly political or materials that caused sort of intercommunal issues. And a number of times they've gotten a slap on the wrist for publishing certain works that offended local Christian communities or the patriarchs of local Christian communities. So definitely Ottoman censorship did play a factor in how political some of these works can get. But I would say that that this concern was more a concern of the Nahda period intellectuals and how they sort of tried to navigate that context when it comes to Ottoman censorship.
With this, I end this book discussion, and thank you
Thank
again.
you.
Before closing off, I just want to show appreciation for being invited here, being presented with your wonderful book. So I brought something from Germany, from our center.
We should have a book discussion for
And
these.
also for you,
Oh,
two
thank
copies. Also to,
We'll invite you more.
of course,
It's
for
beautiful.
promoting our center, the Center of the Studies for Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, Hannah. Thank you, Jan. And thank you. It's beautiful.